Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Saliba, a board member of Freeport Speech. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and a special thank you to our lead sponsors for the evening, David Douglas Stone, Paul and Janice Walsh, and Joe and Carol Wishcamper. Our lead sponsors, community sponsors, and seasoned supporters are the magic ingredient that make Freeport Speech successful in our goal of building community. I'd also like to thank the 13 former speakers at past Freeport Speech events who are here with us tonight in the audience. What a great endorsement of our programs. And one brief announcement, one of our guests is stuck in traffic. Governor Janet Mills is on her way, apologized and wanted to sit in back to not disturb people, but I said, everyone is going to understand. She's on the way, so she'll be here shortly. Tonight is the 7th and final planned event of our 2025 season, starting with Amy Walter and ending with Fiona Hill, with 5 great other events in between, made for a wonderful lifelong learning experience. If you have not done so in the past, for the 26th season, please consider joining our group of supporters. And for our wonderful family of past supporters, please consider renewing for your support for next season. The QR code in your programs or the Join Us page on our website should allow you to make your pledge. We don't need your money right now. Just give us your pledge of support. Tonight's event will be conversations will be enlightening. We are fortunate to have 3 great panelists, so I thought I should tell you something about each of them that you probably have not read or do not know. Barrett Takesian, in a few short years, has become the poster child for new leadership in Greater Portland, Maine, and far, far beyond. His vision for community outreach and what Portland Community Squash has accomplished has become a national role model. Besides all this, Barrett is an avid salsa dancer. Susan Thornton speaks fluent Mandarin and Russian and was a senior diplomat at the US State Department. Last year, Roberta Jacobson, former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, described our Susan Thornton to me as the smartest person she had worked with in her own 30-year career at the State Department. After tonight's conversation, Susan will hold the world record for having been a speaker panelist at Freeport Speech events the most times. Sorry, Dr. Nirav Shah and Admiral Gregory Johnson. Tonight makes 4 for Susan, breaking your tie with her at 3. And finally, our guest of honor. Fiona Hill, quoting the New York Times, as she was in academia and at the White House, Ms. Hill is a trenchant analyst of a troubled world. She has been appointed by the current British government to co-author with the former Secretary General of NATO and a retired British Army general a strategic review of defense policy for an era in which Russia is menacing Europe and the US is retreating from it. Let me remind you all that Fiona will be doing a book signing in the lobby immediately after this event. And the little-known fact, Fiona Hill loves crystallized ginger. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you so much.
I go on the far side.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
Looks like Tom didn't leave anything to chance. We've got crystallized ginger right here at the podium.
Awesome.
But I want to congratulate the Freeport Speech Board on a tremendous season. It's a real privilege to be with you tonight. My name's Barrett Takesian, and we'll get to Portland Community Squash later. But I wanted to start, Susan and Fiona have really had parallel careers, even spending time in the Soviet Union at the same time, and now both with their affiliations to the Brookings Institution. So I'd love to take a back seat for the first half of this talk and have them speak a little bit to their careers and the state of the world today. But in true Fiona fashion, it's always about the solution. So a lot of times we spend the last 5 minutes talking about solutions. We're going to take the bulk of the hour talking about solutions tonight and make sure we leave half an hour for questions at the end. But before we launch into your conversation, I'd love Fiona, maybe just to give us an introduction and some of the topics that we're going to hit on today.
Well, thank you very much. Great to be here. And I was not expecting crystallized ginger. So all I can say is there's a lot we can share. Not sure if everyone's quite got the passion for it that I do. Well, there's a lot to cover, as Barrett has already indicated here. And both Susan and I can obviously cover a lot of the world territory at the moment. One of the things I think which is on everybody's mind is, where are we going in the war in Ukraine? I mean, obviously we've also got conflict in the Middle East, but right now the world looks like a very dangerous place to be. We've got a whole range of conflicts that are intertwining with each other, and we've also come to a situation where, very sad to say, there seems to be incredible disregard for human life. We're 80 years since the end of World War II. We're seeing the breakdown of the UN and other larger systems. We promised ourselves we'd never engage in the mass slaughter of humanity again, and we are doing all of this again. And I think, obviously that's one of the issues that we'd like to discuss tonight about how did we get there and how we can get out of this. Also, of course, what's the future of the United States relationships around the world? That's pretty critical. Susan being one of our most distinguished Foreign Service representatives, serving in multiple different countries, and we've just had the United Nations meetings. We had, I'm sorry to say, not a greatest spectacle at the United Nations that the United States is normally indulged in. It wasn't just the escalator malfunctioning or the teleprompter, but I think, what we're really seeing here is the breakdown of the larger global system. And the question is, what do we really put in place? And what we'd like to talk to all of you tonight and discuss with you is how we start both at the top and also at the bottom. Because in the United Nations at the moment, as Susan's probably done many times, if you talk to the representative of the countries that make up the General Assembly, many of them still want the United Nations to continue. They would like to see the invigoration of the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, because of all the war crimes that are being committed around the world. They want to see the interventions on peacekeeping, on poverty reduction, and the strategic development goals that the United Nations laid out that everyone was trying to aim for over the last few years. They'd actually like to see those fulfilled. So there's a lot of other countries that are not necessarily the leading countries, certainly not the members of the Security Council, that would like to see reinvigorated multinational organizations. And they're wondering, how do they build that up? And here in Maine, and in the United States as well, we're asking the same kind of questions. And that's why we're so delighted to be here at Freeport for a community organization that's trying to make a difference. And also to be here with Barrett, with Portland Community Squash being just the exact idea of a community grassroots organization that's trying to make a difference. So I think tonight we'll try to put all of those things together and talk about how in the international system, as well as the domestic system, we can figure out ways of creating something new. Maybe not building back, but building forward and trying to, basically lean into all of the, let's just say, the players that usually thought of as peripheral or marginal, but actually can make a big difference. So that's where we wanted to start.
Yeah, I would just say, picking up on the theme of the UN, there are certainly many countries around the world, I think most, that, as you said, want the UN to continue, multilateral organizations to continue, because these smaller countries, that is the place where they have a voice, where they have a community to come together. They don't have a lot of power in the international system. But they also do want the United States to continue to play an important role there. And I think one of the things that we're getting wrong is that there is a happy medium between the US doing everything and paying, all the dues, and the US really pulling out of treaties and organizations and things, as we're seeing now. I mean, it's possible for the US to have a more kind of tailored or sort of trimmed down or burden sharing in the UN system, if you want, in the multilateral system, without abandoning all these institutions that we've built up over the last 75 years. So I talk all the time. I spend a lot of time in Asia and talk a lot to countries in Asia. And Fiona and I were talking earlier about, everyone's now talking about China stepping up to be the big next, global power and multilateral kind of leader in the UN. We saw the Chinese come in at the climate statement yesterday and actually offer a new target for their carbon emissions reductions, which of course the US didn't even attend the summit. So there will be now a lot of talk about China stepping up, but when you talk to countries, that's not really what they hope for or see. They hope to see both the United States and China contributing to a lot of these problems around the world, and we really need to reinvigorate US diplomacy if we're going to do that. So that's my plea to all of you for tonight. If I can make one, is the State Department has really taken some major hits, and it's going to need to be repaired because every other country has a foreign ministry, State Department equivalent, so you can't just not have one. But that's, I think, something that we really need to work on at that top-down level, as you were saying.
And if I could ask, what was it like during your careers when these institutions, as you put it, might have been intact better than they are in the moment? I mean, can you share just a little bit about the background of your careers and the places that you've been? Maybe we'll start with Fiona.
It seems that we actually both started off around the same time, although coming from different directions. I started off in the United Kingdom, obviously. I was born and grew up there, and I did my undergraduate work at St Andrews University in Scotland. And I ended up as a student in the Soviet Union in 1987, 1988. At the peak of the Cold War. Some of you around here look like you might remember that as well. Sometimes I have to tell my daughter and other people, what this was. Susan's probably been there as well. The what? and the what? The Soviet Union. And I did a degree eventually in Soviet studies as a master's degree. And within months it had disappeared. So I was already thinking to myself, well, that was a bad investment. Don't put me in charge of future investments, there at all. So I ended up doing a history degree because the Soviet Union was already history. But I went there in 1987-88. It was the height of the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over the placement of missiles, the so-called Euro missile crisis, the European version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, SS-20 and Pershing missiles in Eastern and Western Europe. And one of the reasons that I studied Russian at the time, and Susan's probably got the same impetus, was I thought, the world might end. We might have nuclear Armageddon. And if there was, instead of sort of sitting around or hiding under the table or in, the cupboard under the stairs, which was some of the advice actually from the British government at the time, not super helpful, I have to say, I thought, well, I'll go out and study Russian. And I had this fantasy that maybe I'd end up at the UN. Yeah. I don't know, did you think the same thing?
Yes, the same thing, yeah.
With, big earphones on, trying to translate for arms control negotiations. Because at that time, I thought that's where it all happened. Back in the 1980s, the United Nations was where you thought everything was going to happen, where you would have all of the peacekeeping and the interventions, and everybody was always talking about call up the United Nations. And sadly we heard at the most recent UN Assembly, why bother, with the United Nations? But there was that idea that that would be the locus of peacemaking and then obviously keeping the peace. And so that's where I went off. I went to the Soviet Union, and while I was there, Gorbachev and Reagan had the Moscow summit of 1988, which was that whole feeling that we were on a different trajectory. The missile crisis was stopped by the conclusion of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, the INF Treaty. I can see again that many of you will remember this, and others will be looking it up on Google. But basically, there was this idea that we were in a new era.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the one thing that I will, take away from this arc of the career, going to Russia in that period and now, 40, 50 years on, thinking, how did we get back to a point where we seem to be in this standoff again with Russia as a successor state to the Soviet Union? What happened to all of that promise? And some of it is a story about failures of diplomacy. Some of it's a story about failures of imagination. But I think a lot of it is a story about complacency and of kind of just thinking that a trajectory, once you got onto it, it could not be stopped or something would not divert it. And I think for Susan, and I know that a lot of your career was in the trenches in those far-flung areas of the former Soviet Union, I think it was probably quite obvious to see where things might have gone awry. We couldn't anticipate as we moved on that things might change or might go back to how they had been.
Yeah, well, I remember, and actually I got that same degree in Soviet studies in the spring of '91, which became a degree in history by the winter of '91. So, so we are very like-minded.
Soviet Union specialists.
Yeah, at least we can read Soviet literature or Russian literature, which is great, of course. But I remember the optimism of that time, and people also in, even in my line of work in the State Department, kind of just automatically assuming that everything was going to be going on the up escalator, not the stopped one at the UN, but the up escalator from there. But I have to say, like, being in those former Soviet republics, I was in Kazakhstan and Armenia, those people that lived there and the governments that were running those places were very keenly aware that the story was not over. And they were very worried about what was going to happen to them and the sort of retrenchment and blowback. So to see that it's now still going on, I mean, it really is still going on 30 years later, right? And 35 years later.
We assumed, I mean, just to wrap up on this point, that the collapse of the Soviet Union had been very peaceful. I mean, we all think about what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, which was anything but peaceful. But in actual fact, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not, and we're still dealing with it. Mm-hmm. Because in the 1990s, if you'd been serving in Kyiv in Ukraine in that period, there was already pressure being put on the Ukrainian government from Russia. Vladimir Putin wasn't there in the picture at that particular point. He was off in Leningrad, then St. Petersburg as deputy mayor, shaking down business people. But in Moscow and in some of the foreign policy circles, there was already the idea that Ukraine was the one that got away, and also Kazakhstan. Perhaps not Armenia, but some of the other countries were seen as basically taking away territory that had historically been part of Russia, the northern part of Kazakhstan, for example. But that whole idea then of Ukraine belonging somehow to Russia, to being part of the central myth of Russian history. And in the early part of the 1990s, there was a whole host of acts of provocation in Ukraine. And a group of colleagues of mine, I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard at the time, we wrote a report together called Back in the USSR. It wasn't the most original title at the time, but it was kind of conveying what we were trying to get across, that we could already see in as early as 1992, just a year after Susan and I transferred our master's degrees to historical studies, that there was already an effort to pull everybody back in again, or at least certain parts of the territory. And that was also the period where we were pushing Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and also Belarus to give up nuclear weapons that they'd accidentally inherited, and you worked on all of this in Kazakhstan, from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it wasn't that they actually knew, well, they did know how to use them, but they didn't necessarily have the command and control over these nuclear weapons. And we spent a lot of time in the United States and the government. I mean, there are people here who I think were possibly engaged in this as well. There was a whole effort to get the Ukrainians and Belarusians and the Kazakhs to send the missiles back to Moscow for them to be dismantled. And then, of course, there was an agreement, and all of you keep hearing about this, the infamous by now Budapest Memorandum, that gave Ukraine all these assurances that if they gave up the nuclear weapons, didn't hold on to them, didn't try to figure out how to turn them into their own strategic arsenal, that all would be well, that there would be no threats to their independence or their sovereignty and territorial integrity. And the Russians signed this, the United States signed this, and the UK signed this. And of course, that's where we are now. Just to the extent, of course, that Putin says things have changed. completely ignoring these previous provisions, but also to the point that some of those missile components that have been dismantled have been repurposed and sent back to Ukraine during the course of this conflict. So the Ukrainians have found, some of these missiles coming and hitting civilian buildings just to rub it into them. That they once had an arsenal that most likely would have prevented the Russians from invading them. Of course, this has caused concerns for the Kazakhs, and Belarus has been absorbed by Russia in any case.
Yeah, it's also causing a problem for proliferation concerns around the rest of the world because, of course, the example is out there that you gave up your nuclear weapons, which is what we've been trying to get many countries to do, including North Korea, Iran, and an effort that we undertook with South Africa, which ended up actually working. But now a lot of countries are seeing that the only thing that can actually keep them safe is something like a strategic arsenal. So it's going to be much more difficult, I think, for nuclear proliferation going forward.
Well, both of you really committed so much of your life to diplomacy abroad, including Fiona, who's from the UK and came to the US for her education, has been advocating on our behalf. There must have been a narrative, an American narrative during your time representing this country that you believed in. And I'm curious what that narrative was and if you think that narrative is holding up or if we need to redefine our role in the world right now.
Well, for me, America was the gold standard. I came here for the opportunity of a first-rate education and, then decided to become an American, so American very much by choice and, really glad to be here. But, what I worry about, that gold standard, is anything but at this particular moment. And that goes for the diplomatic service and, that's already been alluded to by Susan. Everybody looked up to the United States for its institutions, for its soft power. And it wasn't just the soft power of American culture, blue jeans and chewing gum, which was the big rage, by the way, in the Soviet Union when we were both there. And unfortunately, coming from the UK, I didn't actually have a pair of blue jeans, so I felt really already kind of at a bit of a disadvantage. But it was that idea that America was a country of promise of democracy, of actually showing an example to the rest of the world, especially after the devastation of World War II, where the United States had been so altruistic and generous and had really been also the guarantor of stability and democracy in Europe and elsewhere, that this was the place to be, this was the place to look up to. And the Foreign Service was absolutely the gold standard of working for the United States government, no matter who was in power. The idea was that you were really serving a state that made a difference, and it absolutely was making a difference.
Yeah, and I guess for me, maybe this is the way that we segue to the other part of the conversation. You're such a genius, Barrett. For me, it was really, the U.S. always had ideas. We were, it's leadership. Leadership is the thing that makes the big difference. It wasn't because the U.S. was the richest country in the world. It wasn't because we had the biggest military. We were always there trying to figure out how to solve problems and come up with ideas on how to go forward. And I think that was what really drew me to the Foreign Service. I wanted, of course, to serve my country and support all those ideals. But it's also when you serve overseas, and I worked in. All my posts were high hardship posts because I actually liked that and it was fascinating. And you don't go to these places for vacation normally, so you can always go to Paris, right, for vacation, but you can't go to Turkmenistan for vacation. But you see these people, and everyone in the State Department has to do a visa issuing tour. So usually it's your first tour. I was in Kazakhstan. You see these people come in, and they're so excited, to go to the U.S. And they're not wealthy, and they're not famous, and they're not, maybe even highly educated. But it's that idea of going to the U.S. and seeing Disney World, or just seeing sort of what it's like to be in such a dynamic and open society, right? Especially a lot of the places I worked were quite closed societies. And the idea that you can go to the U.S. and you can sort of start your life over. You don't have any past pedigree that you have to carry with you, and you can come up and be, the founder of NVIDIA, or you can be, the head of, I don't know, JP Morgan or something, and you don't have to have any special, pass or prestige or pedigree to get there. And I think those are the things that really I thought America stood for.
Yeah.
And it's also taking those ideas and bringing them back to the other countries, because it was also that, as you said, the United States is seen as the great motor of ideas and innovation. And people were sending so many people here to be educated in American universities from across the entire country, not just at the Harvards and MITs, or here, Bowdoin Bates and Colby and everywhere else, but colleges, liberal art colleges in places you'd never thought of. Some students would be coming from around the world because they'd have a great grounding in engineering, and then they might go back and become a civil engineer, back in their own country, or they'd get a great idea for setting up a business, and they'd go back and do that as well. And it was just an incredible, I think, benefit to the United States of just this upswelling of goodwill towards the US. And that's how, indeed we spread American soft power.
Sure.
And American influence, so those kind of connections.
I don't want to look at our history. I mean, I'm speaking as if our institutions have always been the gold standard. I mean, we've been in parts of the world where we shouldn't have in the last 50 years. And there are a lot of forces that lead the US to make the decisions they make. I am curious about each of your own integrity. Both of you have maintained your reputation through decades that were not necessarily easy. I am curious, I mean, we all know Fiona's testimony and what it looked like to see integrity in action in that moment. But can you just tell us a little bit about each of your approaches? I mean, incredible careers and clearly character that carried you through some of these chapters. And what's it like being in these rooms? I mean, are our leaderships living up, in your experience, living up to these ideals? And for those of us in Maine, I mean, not, just talking about in your careers generally. I mean, we're going to get to the current environment. But when we go to the current environment, we're talking local. Okay, we're not taking on the national stuff. That's the switch. But just in your careers, both.
I want to hear Fiona's story, so I'll just be brief. But I work with the Bowdoin McKean Center. I'm a Bowdoin grad, and I, in my mind, have never left Maine since. But when I go and talk about and try to promote the Foreign Service, the question I always get from students is, well, what happens if they ask me to do something that I don't think is right or that I don't want to do? And my answer is always that every one of you has that line, and you may not know what it is right now, but when you're in government service, serving your country, which is a noble thing to do, if you get to a point where you have something that comes up, then you'll have to sort of make that judgment at the time. But I mean, I remember because I was in the State Department, I worked for Rex Tillerson, I was going to be the assistant secretary, and then he got fired and Pompeo came in. And Pompeo, one of the first things he said was, if you can't serve, the president of the United States, if the president wants you to do something and you can't do it, then you have to leave. And so I did. But I think that, but I think that's the way you have to look at it, and what each individual's line is going to be different. I mean, I was against going into Iraq in 2003.
Yeah.
I was serving in China at the time, and what I said to myself was, this is wrong, this is going to be bad for us, but I'm working on China, and what I'm doing is really important right now, and we are doing good things within this relationship, and it's going to be really important, so I'll keep going. So that's how I reckoned with that one.
Yeah. Before you tell your story, I'm going to tell you a story that I haven't told you before, which is that I think a lot of the reason everyone has so much respect for you is you've been bipartisan your entire career, and I've heard you talk about that as being one of your principles. After we formed our friendship and started working on some projects together, I was working at that time for the After School Alliance in DC, trying to improve after-school access in Maine. And you were so instrumental in the work we were doing. I tried to bring you to the table with the After School Alliance. And they said, She's too politically hot right now. We can't associate ourselves with Fiona Hill. Blew me away. But I'm just only to say the inertia wants to either make you a hero or make you a villain. And to be able to keep your integrity, I think that's a good segue into what's catapulted you into the spotlight the last 5 years, Fiona.
Yeah, well, I mean, just on that latter point there, I think we're all in trouble if speaking out and, speaking the truth or, basically trying to call out things is seen as very political, but, that's the environment that we're in. Yes, I mean, that was actually something that I've had to, contend with, that, some people are a bit worried about, me coming and speaking or sometimes, kind of engaging with them because they're worried about political blowback. But I mean, that's exactly why we should all keep, forging ahead. I mean, we've just had a test of limits of free speech with Jimmy Kimmel. And actually, I think what he did in his opening monologue when he came back on again, it's just worth everybody listening to. It was really, very well done and very well said. But it's a rather, sad commentary that, somebody like Jimmy Kimmel, late night host, can be seen as too hot, kind of politically, when, all he's trying to do is, I mean, yes, poke fun at the kind of situation, because humour is what, keeps us all going. But on what Susan said, I mean, my guideline has also been something similar. And when I was agonising about whether I should go into Trump 1.0 or not, because I was very surprised to actually be asked, I went and solicited the opinion of a lot of people that I respected. Some people told me, hell no. And one person said they wouldn't really speak to me again if I did it, because they felt that, if I went into that environment, it would be immediately, kind of problematic, and there was no way that I'd be able to, kind of withstand all of the various pressures. But a number of people said, yes, you should, because of all of the reasons that, Susan was saying out there, because you might be able to do some good, particularly, in the area in which I was working on Russia. I mean, it was always a complicated relationship with Russia, and Vladimir Putin, I'd spent all this time, studying him and studying Russian and, going back to the origin story of both of us deciding to study Russian back in the early 1980s. Then why was I doing all of this if I wasn't going to kind of step up at a moment when I'd been given a request to do that, not just an opportunity, a request to come and to serve and to do something. But the best piece of advice I got was from Martin Indyk, who was one of my bosses at the Brookings Institution. He's sadly passed away now, but Susan would have known Martin also from working with him in the State Department. He was the Assistant Secretary for the Near East. He's actually originally from Australia and had become a naturalised US citizen as well. And he'd been asked at one point to become the envoy for the Middle East. Well, as we all know, that's the kind of a job where, everybody goes to die, literally, because, I mean, nothing, really ever comes out of this. And I'd said to Martin at the time, I was actually in a train with him, going through the German countryside on our way to a conference together. It's just the two of us in this carriage. And he gets a phone call, and I can tell from the phone call something's going on. And he said, he just looked at me, he said, you mustn't tell anybody, but I've just been asked to be Middle East envoy. And I was like, well, okay. And I said, so what are you going to do? And he said, well, there's only perhaps a 6% chance of anything being achieved. And he said, that's probably exaggerating the odds. But if there's just a chance, I should do it. And he said, but, I'll give it a go and then see what happens. And then so I had gone, to talk to him about my decision, because he'd stayed in that job about a year or something like this, and then decided it was actually futile, that he wasn't getting anywhere, and he was actually becoming part of the problem. And that's what he said to me. You go in there and you do what you can. Don't give yourself any longer than 2 years. That's a kind of a normal sort of time if you're in academia or something like this to go. And he said, and while you're part of the solution, you can stay there, but as soon as you become part of the problem, you've got to leave. And that's just exactly, in a way, what you decided to. Yeah. And I realised when Masha Yovanovitch was sacked, Ambassador Yovanovitch, a great naturalised American and another of Susan's long-time colleagues in the State Department, that there was a real problem and that I was in danger of becoming part of it as well. And that's when I started to, beat my retreat out of as well. And just, like for Susan, I always kept it in my mind that I was only there, temporarily This is not a position of power or, kind of influence for me. It's not a kind of a career enhancer. It's an opportunity to serve and to try to do something. But as soon as things are going wrong and you cannot fix them, and you cannot salvage anything from that, then you need to walk away. And I try to do that with as much dignity and everything as I muster, as Susan tried to do as well, and then find another way, to be able to take action. And that was, when I knew that Masha, Ambassador Ivanovic, was being subpoenaed to testify. I thought, well, if I get asked, I've got to go and do the same thing to support Masha, because she was one of the best of the best, like Susan, of our foreign service officers, and had basically been subjected to some horrific form of political mugging. And that she didn't deserve this, and in fact, the American people and everybody else, deserved to know that there was something wrong here. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'll be honest. I'll say this right now. It wasn't, my place to make that decision. I'm not sure whether President Trump should have been impeached. I still struggle with whether that was the right way to approach this, but it was what happened. And I think that standing up in that moment and just telling the truth and being there for other people, really in solidarity is what's key.
Yeah, I'd say far from retreating, I think you handled yourself with incredible dignity. And that brings us to your next chapter. How did you find what your next chapter was going to be, and what impact are you trying to have on the world right now?
Well, look, I think, like Susan, and Susan, will speak for herself on this as well. When you've been in, these kinds of positions, and you've seen what the potential and the capacity of the United States is, and you see that we're in a time of trouble, and you've worked with some amazing people, you kind of know that you still need to do something, and you have to kind of find a way of working with those other, great people to try to find some solutions for the problems that we're in. And one of the things that's always been extremely important for me, and my home was the Brookings Institution, where Susan also has an affiliation. It's the Brookings Institution.edu, and it's not a university or a college, but it does have a role in playing in trying to educate the public or impart information, and also in terms of public policy. And the Brookings Institution is a great platform for certainly highlighting issues, working with other colleagues to try to come up with some ideas of ways that we can move forward on a range of things, the kind of things that you're trying to do here in Portland and Freeport and in Maine. But I also I'm somebody who benefited immensely from education. My father was a coal miner. He left school at 14. He didn't have a formal education. He had no qualifications whatsoever apart from things he learned on the job. And he always wanted to, as he put it, better himself and to learn things. And he always, tried to sign himself up for lectures and all kinds of opportunities if, people were there, doing outreach to the miners. And he and my mother, who trained to be a nurse, always said to me, if you get an education, it's basically a privilege, and you've got to do something with it. And education has been what opened the door for me. First going to university in the UK at St Andrews, I had all my education paid for. I got a grant from the Durham Miners Association of $100. It was £100 actually at the time, to study Russian. They actually gave it to me in an envelope. I asked the man who'd given me the money, because I wanted this for a language course, probably around the same time you were trying to study Russian. And I said, well, what do I do to show you that I've used this money? He said, well, just come back and tell us you can speak Russian, Pet. So I've been spending my whole life trying to prove I speak Russian for the Durham miners. And I took that on very seriously, and I thought, so now, with a role, I'm the Chancellor of Durham University in the UK, back in my home region. I'm also on the Harvard Board of Overseas, which is the advisory board. And I'm trying to kind of figure out, just as everybody else here is, how I can give back in some way. And education is really the key. And this is what's happening here in Freeport. All of this, these discussions that you've been doing, this is part of education, of outreach, what you're doing at Portland Community Squashes education. All the investments that people here are making in all the local colleges. Here in Maine, my daughter's a freshman at Colby College. I'm just blown away by what Colby is doing. And I think that this is where we start. This is the strength of America is in education. Harvard was first set up before the country had appeared. The public land-grant universities were set up in the middle of the Civil War, to pull a country forward. We've always found a solution in education, and that's kind of what I'd like to be more involved in the next phase.
Yeah, I guess for me, I'm also affiliated with the Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. That's where I went after I left the State Department. And I totally couldn't agree with you more. My husband's a teacher. We are very big believers in public education, especially. I went to public schools in Massachusetts. And I think education, I mean, the thing that gives me hope in my darkest days, these days when half my colleagues at the State Department have just gotten fired, is having students come and talk to them and have class with them. I mean, it's so inspiring to see the energy and the sort of dynamic future vision that some of our young people have. And I mean, people that come to Yale Law School have had very good educations already, and they're getting a very good education there, and they very much want to serve, I think, in public positions. But I think, it's more than, Yale University is in New Haven, Connecticut, which has seen better times. I live right now on the line of Lewiston and Lisbon. And, Lewiston, I've known Lewiston for many, many years since going to Bowdoin, and, it's had its ups and downs. It's really trying to come back, but I think a big part of that is also education, and there's a lot going on with public school funding in Maine that we really need to pay attention to, especially, I think, because we're such a huge and rural state. I mean, it's really gotten really hard to support rural schools. We also had a summer house when we were in the Foreign Service out in Lincoln County, and there's, a sort of private school there that is a magnet for all of the surrounding towns, which works really well. So there are innovative things that can be done. I know of high schools where almost the entire student body, these old private schools in Maine, have come from China, and now the whole school is filled with Chinese high school students that are wanting to get into colleges in the US, and so they want to come and have the US experience and learn English and get settled here before they go to university in the US. So there are a lot of things that have happened. A lot of these things are kind of under pressure now. And foreign students, you mentioned the magnet that the US has been for foreign students is also something that I really worry a lot about. So
Great. Well, this is where I kick into gear a little bit.
Good.
So how does the van driving squash coaching guy come to become good friends with Fiona Hill? And why is Fiona Hill in Maine? It's because both of you, having seen institutions at every level of our federal government and the global stage, you're here in Maine for a reason. And you're working back in Durham for a reason. Because the solutions right now, it's easier to heal your local institutions and to heal the cultural ailments of division that have been eroding at our bigger institutions. It's always, for me, it's always been ground up. And I'll tell you a little story. I think James and Becca Everett's are here tonight, but Jimmy and I used to get breakfast together in Portland and talk about building a community center using a couple squash courts. And at the time, I was working with kids in the basement of the YMCA, and I had a day job crunching numbers. And we did it. A group of people came together, and we built a community center. The reason we've gotten some recognition is that we went out around the country looking for the best models in terms of how to build a community center. And it took us all over the country, and we got to Brookings. We had conversations all the way up to the White House, and someone said, go build it. So we worked with the Brookings Institution, Laureate Sport for Good in New York, the Sport for Development Journal in Chicago. We built a peer-reviewed, data-driven, lean, mean fighting machine that's put 700 kids on a path to college. We just passed 1,000 members. We represent every corner of the city of Portland, and we're creating the social bridging and the social capital it takes to get things done. But Jimmy and I, we're aspirational. What's next? What's the next rung of the ladder? And I played with some national foundations, and I worked with the After School Alliance in DC, and I went up the ladder a little bit to check it out. But here you are, I'm still driving the van, and you came to hang out with me. I don't need to go up there. And honestly, the solutions lie on celebrating our community builders. And the more leadership we have, the more community builders. I didn't even know that was a term coming out of Bowdoin. But it's a role I found myself in, and I will go to bat and champion and work with anyone that's driving the van. But our local institutions need business acumen. They need volunteers like the people in this room giving time, treasure, and talent. Anyone can be a flash in the pan and run a great program for a couple years. Can you build a gymnastics studio or a community theater or a ceramic studio that's going to last for 50 to 100 years? If you're going to do that, you have to build the business engine behind it. And so I think the calling to this room, and I'm curious to hear the projects, and Susan has a project going with soil and farming as well, but we need to strengthen these local institutions.
Yeah, we do.
And we have every walk of life in this little city of Portland. If we can make it work in this city, it's evident that we can do it. Bring the UN back, frankly. Like get these organizations working.
Yeah, and this is not far-fetched. So Tom mentioned at the beginning that I've been involved over the last year with the UK Strategic Defence Review. And this was launched by the Labour government just immediately after it came into office in July of 2024. And I was somewhat surprised to be asked. As Tom mentioned, there were 3 lead reviewers. It was led by Lord George Robertson, who's the former Secretary General of NATO and former UK Defence Secretary, who had led another major review back in 1998. So really, at the end of the whole Cold War, and at a time when, again, we thought that the security environment was going to be more benign. And then the former head of Strategic Command, Lord Richard Barron. So we were a bit of a kind of an odd trio, really. We kept joking about the 3 witches of Macbeth, and Hubble Bubble and all the rest of it. But then we had what was unique about this review was there's an external review and a review that actually tried to take the temperature of the whole population for what they thought national defence should look like. And it was against the backdrop of, why did we need to do this? Well, 2 big things had changed. One was the war in Ukraine, because last time had been a review was before the Russian invasion. And of course, the war was already underway for 2 years by the time that we launched this review. Now it's 3 years. And as I said at the very beginning, it's brutal. The citizenry, ordinary people, are the major casualties of that conflict and every other conflict as well. And we see the kind of carnage we saw in World War I at the same time as, World War II and 21st century drone warfare. I mean, this is really a kind of now a great sign of the very dangerous trajectory, that we're on, that puts all the homelands in Europe and the United Kingdom and, also here in the United States at risk. You just saw Denmark having this drone, sophisticated drone. It wasn't really an attack, but certainly activity around the main airport in Copenhagen. And everybody now knows that, we're no longer on the trajectory we were before and as safe as we were. And then the second factor was the United States. So the United Kingdom was always priding itself on the special relationship with the US, in intelligence and defense and trade and, you name it. But even before President Trump was re-elected, there was a realization that the relationship with the US was not going to be the same. Because, if we could go back to the Cold War, and US leaders were telling the UK and other Europeans, come on, you can't rely on us like this for forever. And it's been 80 years. It's still the kind of like Europe is living in the US's basement, kind of waiting, for the US to make all the decisions on security. And it's, that was always a dangerous situation to be in. And there was already a feeling back in July of 2024 that the US was not going to be in the same place. President Obama talked about leading from behind. The US was going to also encouraging Europe. They'd already said that the Europeans should spend more on their defense. And it was very clear that the writing was on the wall. Either the US was fading to grey or was cutting to black immediately. And the UK would have to think about that. It's between a rock and a hard place of Russia and the challenges of China technologically and everything else as well, but also the hard place of trying to deal with a whole different relationship with the US. And ultimately, to kind of fast forward to get back to where we started here, we came to the conclusion that we needed a whole of society approach to defence. It wasn't just about whether the UK needed 2 aircraft carriers or 3, it's only got 2, and whether it needed F-35 this or that, or it definitely needed to refurbish its nuclear submarine fleet because of what Susan just talked about, which was the risks now of nuclear proliferation. And as you know, the UK and France are the only 2 other NATO countries with their own nuclear capacity, and in the UK it's all submarine based. And so that was an obvious thing, but it was more about how do you defend the homeland, and it's about being resilient. And every time we looked at something, we realized that the fact that there was such huge inequality and glaring divisions in the UK, that there were inequities in health, that there were inadequacies in education, that many parts of the UK, if you took London out, were some of the poorest parts of Europe. And that's usually where people were being recruited, just like in the United States. You know, when there's a lack of opportunities, the military or the armed forces look like an opportunity for people. And it turned out that only 75% of the recruits had just the basic health because of inequities in healthcare, which obviously are experienced in rural areas, to be able to enlist in the military. The biggest problem was teeth, actually. And I'm sure that's you'll all laugh because British people in Tories have teeth. But British people's teeth are terrible. It turns out they're even worse than you think. I'm lucky to have them. So it's like, I think every day, thank God I don't have false teeth like all my grandparents and everything else did. But that was the biggest complaint. The biggest complaint was that dental health was dreadful and people couldn't be recruited into the military. And once they got in there was not sufficient dental care. So we thought, gosh, this is all part of this whole defence complex. Mm-hmm. And how do you fix it? You've got to go to the grassroots. Because it was obvious that the central government couldn't tackle all of this. And the Ministry of Defence couldn't be in charge of people's oral hygiene or in terms of the educational system or the National Health Service, and there was transportation. Everything was intertwined. And so we decided that we needed to have a national conversation about defence. We tried to start one off. We reached out and created citizens' assemblies. Mm-hmm. So we did kind of like what we're doing here in Freeport. We randomly selected, with the help of an outside agency, groups of people who were in the electoral district around 4 or 5 key military bases. Air Force, Naval, Army base, and also one of the intelligence bases where they do a lot of the signals and other intelligence. And there was a focus group with them beforehand, asking them what they thought about defence. Then they were taken to a base and got to interact with everybody. Then we did a focus group with them afterwards and asked them what they thought, and then we did some polling. And what was really interesting was the thing that people cared about most was the people they met. It wasn't the stealth bomber equivalents or the drones or this or that or the other, or the high-tech equipment. It was the people that they met, and they related to the people, and they felt that the people were being underserved, and that their view of defence was engaging with the people in these services, and that's how they came to those conclusions. So again, the whole idea was more connections between people, not people just deciding things from the top. Mm-hmm. They wanted the military service people that they met to be well equipped, obviously, but they started to understand that defence was all about us, and the defence had to begin at home, and it was all about creating resilience. And so we've yet to see, unfortunately, this national conversation take place, but we're continuing to try to push it, and that's kind of something that I think that we need to think about here. In the US, there's some ominous stories of the Secretary of State of Defense, trying to summon all the generals to Quantico in the next few days for some, God knows what that's going to be. But I think that defense really all begins here, because it's defense of ourselves, of our communities. It's thinking about how we make ourselves more resilient and how do we become more adaptable to everything the world is throwing at us, be it climate issues. You get some whacking nor'easters up here in Maine and elsewhere, so everything from a natural calamity to something more serious, and all of our critical infrastructure is at risk. Yeah. And that would be really devastating. It's not just kind of taking the lights out, but water supplies, electricity, huge demand on electricity. So every bit of defense is really about all the things that we're talking about, because it's really trying to figure out how do we make the strongest societies possible.
Absolutely, from a defense perspective. And then you speak to resiliency and the importance of social mobility. Where there isn't hope, that's where there's space for populist ideas to oversimplify our institutions, give you a quick answer, and frankly turn each other against each other. But we haven't said our buzzword that we talk about all the time, which is social capital. We had coffee today with Colin Woodard, and
There he is.
absolutely. I keep finding these studies, people coming from different backgrounds that are coming to the same place. And we were talking about Raj Shetty's Harvard study. Social connection is a 70% determinant of social mobility. It's as simple as forming relationships across all those disparate parts of your community. You're telling me it's national defense, it's resilience to populist ideas and oversimplifications. And Susan, maybe you could share a little bit about how you're using the farm to tackle a little bit of social bridging as well.
I'll just tell a quick story because it's another Portland NGO and we should give them a shout out. But when I was leaving the State Department, I knew I would be leaving soon, and I was looking for my farm in Maine that I was determined I was going to go to after I got out of the State Department. I called up a real estate broker and to ask about this place, and she said, "Oh, well, I don't know about that. The owners, they have this farming NGO on the land, and they have a lot of farmers there, and they run a training program for immigrant farmers, and they really want the new owners to continue with that. And so, I don't know how you feel about that." I'm like, I love that. I was in Washington. She came with the video camera to take the film of the place, and it was just fantastic. So the NGO is called Cultivating Community. Maybe some of you know it. They're in Portland.
Oh, brilliant.
And they are doing fantastic work. They do community gardens in Portland, but they also, bless their hearts, have a farm that they lease in, I think it's Falmouth, and they also work on our farm, part of it. And we have a number of wonderful immigrant farmers from Africa. Some of them have gone off to form their own New Roots Collective in the Lewiston area. They're at all the farmers markets in the region, and they are just the loveliest, hardest working farmers you've ever seen. And it's been such a pleasure to have them with us. And so they're rotating through. They have new farmers that come and do this training program, learn how to farm in America after you've been farming in Somalia in a civil war. It's a little different. So they do that, and then they keep them sort of outfitted, and they provide them with help to connect them to markets and things like that. So, and their kids come, the whole family comes and farms. It's just, it's been so wonderful. So they've been doing that now on our farm for, I think, about 15 years. And it is a really great way, too, to integrate the community. So I really appreciate them, and it's another way of sort of giving back to the community and integrating the community in cross-cultural ways.
Yeah,
That's
thank you, Susan.
That's really good.
I
We could all listen to this for 2 hours more, but we want to leave a little bit of time for questions. I ask you two things. Number one, make your questions short and concise. No follow-up questions, a single question. No speeches, please. But if we can turn the lights up a little bit, is that all right? Are you ready for questions?
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just do a little close my piece too. And Fiona, if you want a quick little closing statement before we go to the questions. The reason I got into this work is because we drove a van to the schools, and we're missing so many kids. We're missing that next farmer. We're missing that next cello player. We're missing the next rock climber. When we give kids and families these opportunities, and when I work with programs, I look for multicultural programs and I look for multi-generational programs. I think that's extremely important. But when we do get that family involved. You're giving them a passion for their life. You're giving them a network that's going to create that path to opportunity, to relationships, and to well-being. And that's all we could ask for anyone here in Maine. So the story that I'm going to be working on with Fiona for a long time is, what does a ballet studio in New York, a rock gym in Memphis, Tennessee, and a squash club in Portland, Maine have in common? This is the next wave of American community centers. And the reason we took community centers is because that term doesn't have cachet anymore. What happened? So we're going to bring it back, and we're putting some real business and some real systems behind it to make sure that community centers are a big part of American life for a long time. So first of all, to spend a day with Fiona is the ultimate treat. So I feel so lucky, but she can go into depth on every topic. She's one of the smartest people I've ever been with. To only have an hour with you all is terrible. But she's on a podcast every other day. There's nothing for you here. Her book is phenomenal, and it does get to these solutions and her story. And she might have a new book coming out soon. Fingers crossed.
I have to write
we'll
it.
see.
Finish writing it, yes. Yeah.
But anyway, it's a pleasure. Thanks for letting me have my first panel with you all tonight. It was pretty fun for me. Yeah. And you want to go right to questions? All right, so we're good to go to questions, and Fiona can do a little closing statement at the very end.
Great, wonderful.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions here? Yes, over here. Wait for your microphones, please.
Thank you for an excellent talk. But nobody on the panel mentioned anything about the health of the United States as a global issue and as a local issue as well. Just look around this room. Look around this room. We have the oldest population in the country.
The question, please. The question.
Why did you not discuss anything, not one word about public health and the health of this country was mentioned in your talk? I'm just curious to know.
Shall we go?
Who would like it?
Well, I'll only say an hour's not fair because Fiona was on, I think 2 hours today was spent on public health.
Yeah,
it's something you care a lot
no,
about. So why don't you just touch on it?
I think we've actually talked around it and touched on it. I mean, when we were mentioning about the United Nations, for example, and the fact that one of the things that is most valued by all the countries that are members of the General Assembly, among them is all of the work on global health. And in fact, I mean, Susan, in the endeavour on the farm, all of that is literally key to that because,
providing
if we don't
good,
have
healthy food to people.
sustainable food, all of these issues in the health of our communities. But you're right, we didn't touch on public health quite as directly as you were phrasing in the question. And this is obviously a very difficult time here in the United States when public health is under assault. So I have a very personal experience of public health. My mother was one of the very first cohort of midwives and nurses in the UK that was set up with the creation of the National Health Service in the late 1940s, 1950s. She was in the second wave of a very early program to basically create a whole group of public health officials and visitors in the wake of World War II to rebuild the country. And this was a whole period when the United Kingdom was working with the United States on the development of vaccines. My mother was actually partly deaf from having measles. And one of the very first things that she did as a health visitor and a midwife and in addition to delivering babies, was going around administering vaccines to people. Many of you here will have been some of the first recipients of the polio vaccine, for example, and the very first group. I got and many of you here would do, but others will not. Barrett, you probably didn't get this, the BCG against smallpox, because the assumption was, that we would eradicate it. And we now know that actually the BCG vaccine, which is not the Boston Consulting Group my husband works, I always have to keep telling you that there was a vaccine, that is actually now been shown to really boost the immune system in many different ways. It's also a treatment for bladder cancer, for example, and they're also thinking that actually the BCG vaccine has been helping to slow down rates of dementia. Now, so I spent a lot of time thinking about public health. My husband also is in consulting on vaccines. He used to work for Merck, Sharp and Durham and Biogen that did some of the first treatments, as you know, down in Boston for multiple sclerosis. He worked on the chickenpox vaccine. And if you go around the world to all the places that Susan has served in, and still to the United Kingdom, people cannot believe that the United States would be having these kinds of debates. People used to actually line up to be vaccinated, to take part in public health drives. We've cut off, and Susan can talk to this, around the world now, assistance for people literally on the front lines of public health disasters. We all have colleagues that worked at US Agency for International Development. And this is an international, not just a national tragedy. But we can deal with this also in a community. We're already hearing that the whole Northeast corridor, not just New England, is putting together a vaccine mandate. The same is happening on the West Coast. Blue Cross Blue Shield, of course, in Massachusetts, started off as a regional and state-led, kind of approach to creating a larger, and I mean, many of you here are probably all involved in this, health management organization, which is actually what the National Health Service is. And the National Health Service now is obviously under a lot of trouble and strain in the UK, but there are lots of debates now about how you could bring it back to the community. Because before the National Health Service started, there were things called doctors' clubs and dentist clubs. The dentist clubs obviously weren't totally fantastic, and they usually involved people pulling their money to have their teeth pulled out, in all seriousness. That was actually 21-year-olds would get for their 21st birthday a voucher to get their teeth pulled out before they all rotted. My grandmother had one of those and was one of the people who collected the money. So that's not a great model. But the model for the doctors' clubs was a great one, because what it was communities pooling their resources. So it's exactly like Blue Cross Blue Shield on a community level to basically have access to a doctor before the National Health Service came back. And actually in the UK now they're starting to think about some of these old approaches to community medicine to try to revitalise, public health when there's too much strain on the national level resources. And I have colleagues at the Brookings Institution. There's a gentleman named Stuart Butler, a number of others who you can have a look at, who are really starting to think about how you could revitalise US public health at the state and local and community level, not just waiting to see what's happening at the national level. And frankly, that's where we might be headed. But Susan, you might have something to say on it from the USAID perspective and also from the Foreign Service perspective.
Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is not my area of expertise, but I do know that, the U.S. pullout from the World Health Organization, for example, we know none of these organizations are perfect. We understand that there are a lot of politics involved, but the symbolism of that, of the U.S. withdrawing from the World Health Organization is, when you think about what leadership is in the world, it's influence. And to have influence in the world and to bring our ideas to the world and to show leadership in the world, we've got to be present in these crucial kind of frontline, public-facing organizations where we have so much expertise. The U.S. is still the crown jewel of kind of public health expertise. It's really important that we keep that. So if we can work on that too at the local level and the higher levels, I think that'll be key.
You should know that the board of Freeport Speech is working on this exact subject for one of our programs for next season.
Oh, fantastic.
Exactly this.
That's great.
So thank you for the question.
Yeah. The only thing, and it's not so much to that point, but I learned from Fiona today, do you just wait out the current administration and try to claw back at the way the institution was? And you spoke to it earlier, we're not building back, we're building forward. And so what scope is each one of these institutions? Mm-hmm. Are they county level? Are they the New England corridor? So I think it'll be interesting if some of these institutions get reshaped, at what level does each? And I see a lot of public health experts in this room that all work at different levels of government. So I think it's curious where the solution is.
Well, and the state of Maine would be a great place to start thinking about this, because you've got a relatively small population in a vast area. It would be a great model also for cities and rural areas. The biggest problem in the United States in health is in rural areas. Where we've lost rural hospitals. And I was just in Idaho, and I was at a conference like this, and we had the head of obstetrics from one of the major hospital units, and she said that 1/3 of obstetricians had just left Idaho, because of the recent, anti-abortion laws, but that had just devastated the whole of women's health. And now they were all trying to rethink about how they reconstitute that in Idaho, irrespective of where the legal situation was. And Idaho is an enormously rural state. I mean, similar sort of population to Maine, and also a vast territory. So these are kinds of things that Maine could become a model, for other places.
And as I mentioned, Fiona can go on any topic.
Yeah,
so what other topics
question?
are?
Other questions?
I see Asghar here. There's a former Portland Community Squash student at Bowdoin these days.
Oh, hey.
Hey.
Thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you, Barrett, for inviting me. This is a very valuable experience. One question I had geared more towards Susan and Fiona, and all the work that you do, and with major terms aside, like ceasefires and negotiations and peace agreements, connecting back to Barrett's point about own integrities, how do you personally measure success or a job well done in the Foreign Service and diplomacy?
Oh, great question.
Oh dear.
Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, I mean, basically, my whole career, the way I thought about diplomacy is that we should be kind of out there on the front lines, making friends and pushing forward U.S. influence and U.S. interests. And you have to balance a lot of things when you're out there in the field, right? Obviously, every country where you are, they have their interests and they have their problems and their challenges. The thing that I find is most lacking in U.S. diplomacy is a complete lack of understanding, but more a lack of appreciation that someone on the other side has their own concerns and their own history and their own culture and their own sort of way of thinking about things and approaching things. And one of the things that really bothered me a lot about U.S. diplomacy that I saw a lot of times when I was serving back at headquarters is there was just less of an appreciation for the reality of the situation on the ground, how much space there was to, on the other side, really move and compromise. And I think, this was particularly true after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War, when the U.S. became this unipolar superpower. We seemed to sort of, again, we kind of had this vision that we were just going to go on this kind of upward trajectory, everything was going to be great, and we would be in charge and tell people what to do, and it would all be fine. And I think that was problematic in many cases. But the success you make is you sit down in a room with someone and you start to understand where they're coming from, and then you can actually, you have to build some trust. They can't think that you're only out to get what you want. Again, it sounds trite, but you do have to come up with a kind of a positive sum goal and work toward that. And when you do that, you build incredible amounts of not only trust and understanding, but also influence, because other countries see that you are actually caring about that they get something out of whatever it is, the problem that you're working on. So I think for me, it was like small incremental wins that maintained that relationship. And I felt like in Washington, a lot of times they didn't really care about the relationship part, which you can't do anything without, maintaining that. So I think that's why I spent 2/3 of my career in the field. I really liked being out in the field. A lot of people like to stay at headquarters. I was a field person, and the Foreign Service is kind of divided that way. But I always got a lot of satisfaction from just working on my problem with my counterparts in that government and sort of trying to push forward a problem and get it, the ball down the field. It's very hard in sort of the intractable problems that Fiona was talking about. Now we're in bloody conflicts in many places in the world, and that's a failure of diplomacy for sure. And certainly in most of those cases, I would submit that if there had been some better diplomacy done at a much earlier stage, we might have been able to, avoid the worst case scenarios that we see coming to fruition. Now, I work a lot on China, and this is what I'm working on every day, is to avoid that 2027 Taiwan invasion that everyone reads about every week on the front page of the Time magazine. I think we've been successful in managing that very, very complicated situation since 1945 basically, or 49 especially. So I think you can do it, but it takes a lot of patience and and sort of in-depth work with counterparts.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I think that's a really good set of examples. Maybe
Barrett, how do you
another
measure
question?
success?
Well, the Barrett that sits on a computer all day has to look at data, but obviously the reason I do it, I'm one of the most relationship-rich people in this room, and I want the families that I work with to enjoy the same riches that I've been fortunate to take from my work at Portland Community Squash. So, access to well-being, access to relationships, access to opportunity for every person that I have the pleasure and our team has the pleasure of working with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions? Right here, please. The microphones. Right over here.
Oh, there's one right here. Sorry, Tom. I think he has the microphone. Yeah.
I have a question. Can I ask a question, Tom?
Sure.
Okay. Really quickly, you talked about the assault on public health. This is not just a somewhat older audience, but pretty highly educated. You've talked about Bowdoin, Colby, Harvard, Yale.
Yeah.
We have a pretty strong assault on higher education right now, particularly sort of the liberal arts type of learning and interaction, intellectual curiosity. I've taught Chinese students for the last 4 or 5 years, many of them desperate to come to the US for graduate school, law school, but now it seems like mostly going abroad.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on how to deal with the issue of access to higher education that will not be a reverse brain drain in the United States?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because the one thing is we have to remember in the US, we don't have a monopoly on the English language. First of all, it's the English language, and the English don't have a monopoly on it either. But there are more English speakers in India, than there are in the United States and in the UK, for example. And the Indians have seen education as an economic sector and as an engine of growth, as the United States did, back in the 1860s onwards. You're seeing an awful lot of the development of campuses of Indian universities, often privately run by big Indian investors, not in India itself, but around the world in the Gulf, some even here in the United States. And I think that the more that, and this is just on one aspect of your question, that we see a clamp down here on international students or on the kinds of things that people can learn at university or the subjects that are taught, the more that we'll see people, as you're actually pointing out there, go for other opportunities. I mean, we have 1.2 million foreign students in the United States. In some cases, they keep entire small colleges afloat. I think it's one of the Illinois Technical Colleges. It was like 80-odd% of the student body is international, because it's all in engineering, for example. And I'm sure these are the kinds of things that you're thinking about. They create, hundreds of thousands of jobs and millions of revenue. And for small towns and regions as well. I mean, Boston, without the universities, can you imagine, what it would look like? And Massachusetts turned the whole, region around after the downturn in the 70s and 80s. Colby helping to turn around Waterville. We've talked about what Bowdoin and Bates and other, colleges are doing. So there's that aspect of it. But I think the biggest problem that we have, as you're alluding to, is access to education. And the big divide in our societies in the US and in the UK is who gets an education, who doesn't. So basically 60% of Americans don't have anything beyond high school, including high quality vocational education. And it's actually the same in the United Kingdom. And you're getting a kind of feeling that education is a luxury item that's exclusive, not inclusive. And of course, that's why Harvard and other places have come under attack, because an idea that they're trying to basically provide a luxury good. And if you think about all the investment in the facilities and the perks for students, that's often how it appears. But I think that given all the research that's going on in places like Harvard, for example, you mentioned Raj Chetty, and his group at Harvard and MIT, who've done all this pioneering research on social mobility, social capital, inequality. There's obvious ways in which the educational institutions can put their research into action and to apply it. And I think, as we look into the future, the kinds of things that Colby is doing in terms of revitalization of Waterville, or this new announcement of all initiatives up and down the Maine coast, other universities and colleges are doing that, as well. All of these platforms are now being developed to make the content of classes at MIT and Harvard. They have this online platform called Axim that they're making available to community colleges and to other institutions across the US and internationally. And of course, Arizona State University's got this amazing model, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, where, for example, Starbucks has a deal with ASU where all of its employees can basically take courses online, and they've got a rule where you can just enroll online in courses, and if you get a B average, even if you're not paid for the courses, you can then enroll into a full-time course, and you can get credit for those courses. And I mean, they've got more students enrolled in ASU internationally and in the United States than we actually have on their multiple campuses in the system. So I mean, there's another model of approaching this. And I think that's what we're going to have to think about. We're going to have to think about how we adapt the educational system to give everyone access to something. You could have universities working with vocational schools, not being forced to do it, but just doing it as a matter of course. And it's one of the things at Durham in the UK where we're thinking about this. I mentioned my father was educated actually through something called the Workers' Educational Association in the UK, which was set up because so many people left school at 14, as my dad did, or 16, and never got further education to help them, reskill, retrain, and to have access to things that they would be interested in studying. And the kinds of work that's going on, the farming, teaching and training people. This is what we have to do. We've got to create a whole ecosystem of this, and you're doing that already at Portland Community Squash, because many of the people that you've mentored have now gone on to college and to other positions and things.
Well, I think the stories that resonate with you are the creative pivots that universities are making. We're going to be at the Rue Institute tomorrow morning having some meetings with the leadership. I mean, that's a university that came in and said we want to be embedded in the local business community day one, and that's a novel model. ASU, novel model. Colby making massive investments in Waterville, that was a big bet that's paying off. But as a big, wealthy institution, and Fiona will be at the Harvard board meeting this weekend, it's your responsibility to make yourself relevant to your constituents. And in many cases, similar to Durham University in the UK, you're in a town that really needs you. And so how are you going to make yourself relevant to not just your 2,000 students, but the 200,000 people that live in the greater metropolitan area around you?
We have time for just two more real quick ones. Mr. Parker?
Yes, thank you very much.
I think it's good.
There were some allusions and talk about institutions being damaged, and the fact that some people walk away when there is things. I'm sorry, words. Things that are going to be antithetical to what they believe in. Wondered if the panel has any idea or any comments on the advantages and disadvantages of intentionally staying in place in that kind of situation to put forward an idea that you think is proper.
So I think a lot of people came to me, I was in the leadership of the East Asia Bureau at the State Department in Washington during the first Trump administration. A lot of people came to me and asked me if they should leave. And I pretty much told all of them that no, they should stay if they could. Like I said, everyone has that line. Some of them, actually almost everyone stayed. And I think you find across the US government that most people in the first Trump administration, even if there were things that were happening at their institution or sort of gutting of institutions, they tried to stay. And so I think most career civil servants, the people I served with at the State Department were some of the best, most talented, most dedicated public servants you'll ever see. They would all stay, and many of my colleagues are still there. The one thing that is happening, though, is there is an effort I mean, certainly my peer group has been very much damaged. I mean, one of my very good friends was the ambassador in Indonesia, and she was just recalled for no reason. She happens to have a Muslim-sounding name, and they sent out another one of my peers, a guy, to do her job. He's not confirmed. She was confirmed, and went out. So, I mean, it's just, there are a lot of things happening, and they're not going to give people jobs. So if you don't have a job, you know, and pretty much most people that have left, I found that they really didn't have a choice because they weren't being given anything to do. So that's really a new thing for, I think, our government, certainly for the State Department, certainly for the Foreign Service. It's very hard to fire Foreign Service officers, and yet, you know, they have found ways to do it. So it's been, I mean, it's been quite, you know, I'm a member of the Foreign Service Union. They've really done a lot of work to try to figure out how to get people out of the State Department. Let me just say that. So I think there's really not a question of people staying in and trying to either make it, you know, through the hard times, or, you know, just getting out willy-nilly. I mean, most of these people have been in for quite some time, and we've been through, I mean, we had people that had to go to Afghanistan and Iraq during the wars, so we have directed assignments. I mean, people in the State Department are not for the faint of heart, I don't think so. I mean, they'll stay if they can. So, and I think a lot of people at a lot of agencies, many of the agencies that I worked with, I feel like this is very, very common. I mean, I've known a lot of people across Washington that stuck it out at their agency for as long as they could. So I think that isn't...
Last question's up here. We really have to get Fiona out for the book signing. But the last question, please, briefly.
We all know that there has always been an undercurrent of religious intolerance, both at the grassroots level all the way up to the top. And I am assuming that each of you has run into situations where you have had to address that. Can you speak to that and how we as a community can become more tolerant of one another for these most basic self-understandings that we hold?
I think that was a wonderful last question. Thank you for asking it.
Yeah, and it's a very big question. I think, you know, both of us in the roles that we were playing, you know, the whole effort was to be, you know, tolerant and accepting of everyone from every faith and creed and imaginable background. I mean, that used to be at the very heart of the Foreign Service and across the US government. This kind of idea that everyone, you know, was welcome. To be honest, I mean, that's when I came to the United States back in 1989. I thought that was what the United States was all about, you know, because so many people, you know, came to the United States from other places having been persecuted for their religion, you know, for their ethnic background, or, you know, so many other things, political positions. And I think that this is, you know, something where all of us have to really rise to the occasion. We all have to find a way in our own lives and in our communities of changing that approach. You're certainly trying to do that in Portland Community Squash, because you have so many people from different backgrounds and faiths here. I think if you're part of a religious community, to try to be... So my religious community is a bit muddled. My grandparents were Quakers on one side of my family, and, you know, the Quakers have kind of done themselves out of business because they never really proselytized, you know, so, and there's not a lot to get upset about for Quakers, you know, so my daughter went to a Quaker school, and it was so many different faiths. There were very few Quakers actually, you know, at the school, but I found Quakerism very important also as a kind of an underpinning of tolerance. And other parts of my family were Methodists, which again is another, you know, congregationalist, you know, bringing people in. And my mother volunteered at a non-denominational church in her later part of life, because her original church had closed down because there was only 5 people in the community in that congregation. And so this was, anybody was welcome. And so my own experience of religion is one in which everybody is welcome. It doesn't matter what faith you are, you can come in and sit down. You certainly can in a Quaker meeting room. You just have to sit in silence, until kind of something might move you to say something, but you're always welcome. And Methodism was very much the same. Congregationists bring people in through the door. And although I'm not advertising, either of those religions to anyone here, I'm just saying there is something to be really said for being able to come in and to share your faith with others and to share your perspective. And that's honestly why I thought America was. And the more that we can, bring that back through these kind of efforts, the better.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the reason I'm in Portland, Maine, is because I believe Portland can be that place, and I commend our governor and the current administration and our local leadership for having Maine be a tolerant place. And just bringing it back to national security, we took on this brave topic of global issues and local solutions. But I've seen so many first-generation families bring their culture, bring their religion to Portland and succeed and support their families in every corner of the world. We're so lucky to have all these families in Maine, and it is such an important national security interest that the U.S. can be a breadbasket for communities all over the world. I know families that live in Sudan that have a tremendous goodwill towards Portland, Maine, because their Uncle Alari is here working 3 jobs to send money home and to be that bridge of opportunity. So Portland, we have the opportunity to get it right. I think it's an absolutely worthwhile pursuit, and I appreciate you asking the question.
Yeah, well done, Barrett.
Thank you, Barrett. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Fiona. Book signing in the lobby. We'll see you next spring. No, next winter. We'll probably be here in January. We're working on it, and thank you all for supporting us.
How is it?
I'd like you to get the
Okay, good.